and welcome to this video on Business and Entrepreneurship Education Grade 8. Today, we'll look at the second part of Unit 4, which is on finding funds. The learning objectives for this lesson are to identify the different sources of finance and to evaluate the different sources of finance. Sources of finance. Finance is needed by entrepreneurs for different reasons. Sometimes a small amount is required, and at other times a larger sum of money is needed. The amount needed depends on the purpose for which the money is needed. There are different sources of finance. Finance can come from inside or outside of the business. Common sources of finance. As stated before, finance can come from within the enterprise, which is known as internal sources of finance, or from outside the business, which is known as external sources of finance. Examples of internal sources of finance are savings, profits, and sale of idle assets. Examples of external sources of finance are loans from banks and borrowings from friends and relatives. Internal sources of finance. Internal sources of finance is money obtained from within the business, that is, inside of the business. Examples of internal sources of finance. Number 1, savings. Savings is money kept aside for future use. It is often seen that entrepreneurs invest their personal cash to start up their business. Advantages of using savings as a source of finance are: firstly, it is a cheap form of finance. It is readily available and it does not need to be repaid. Number 2, profits. All entrepreneurs want to make profits. They can use part of the profit made to reinvest in the enterprise instead of borrowing from banks or from friends. Number 3, sale of idle assets. An entrepreneur can also sell furniture, vehicles, or equipment he no longer needs to obtain additional finance. He can use this money to expand his enterprise or for other purposes. External sources of finance. External sources of finance are money obtained from outside the business. Examples of external sources of finance are: number 1, loans from banks. A bank loan is money lent by bank for a given period of time against payment of interest. It is usually approved under certain repayment conditions. Bank loan has to be repaid with interest. Interest is the additional sum of money paid on the amount borrowed. Loans can be granted for a short period of time or for a longer period of time. Short-term loans are loans which have to be repaid in less than 1 year, whereas long-term loans are loans granted for more than 3 years. Security. What is security? Very often, borrowers have to provide security as a guarantee that the loan will be repaid within the agreed time period. The security is usually in terms of personal belongings like bungalows or a plot of land. Information needed by banks before granting loans. Before granting a loan, the bank usually requires certain information about the enterprise. These information are purpose, amount, repayment period, and security. Calculating loan interest. The formula to calculate yearly interest on loan is yearly interest payment is equal to rate of interest per year times the funds borrowed. The formula to calculate monthly interest on loan is monthly interest payment is equal to total interest paid divided by the number of months. For example, if John, an entrepreneur, decides to take a bank loan of 500,000 rupees with a 6% interest rate, he will have to pay an annual interest of 6 divided by 100 times 500,000, which equals to 30,000 rupees. And the monthly interest is 30,000 divided by 12 is equal to 2,500 rupees. Number 2, borrowing from relatives or friends. An entrepreneur may decide to borrow money from friends and relatives instead of taking a bank loan. Borrowings from friends and relatives is usually short-term and may not involve interest. Choosing sources of funds. An entrepreneur has to choose carefully the source of funds as it can affect the business positively or negatively. Internal sources of finance. Number 1, owner's savings. The advantages of owner's savings are money is easily and readily available, and there is no interest to be paid. Disadvantages of owner's savings. Amount available may not be sufficient, and it may cause stress if the owner does not have sufficient amount of money. Profits of the business. Advantages: money is easily and readily available, and no interest has to be paid. The disadvantage of using profits in the business is owners will have less profit for themselves. Sale of idle assets. Assets are the possessions of a business, like for example, machines, equipment, or furniture in the business. Advantages of sale of idle assets. Income is earned from unused assets, and money is easily and readily available. Disadvantages: assets will have to be replaced, and larger amount of money will be required to replace new assets. Borrowings from friends and relatives. Advantages: it is easy as funds are available without formal procedures. Repayment can be easily adjusted, and no or very low charges of interest. Disadvantages: some friends or relatives may not be willing to lend money. The entrepreneur may not get the amount required. The borrower may be uncomfortable if the amount borrowed is not returned on time. Loans from banks. Advantages: full amount of funds required can be obtained. It helps in reducing the tax amount. No interference in the running of the enterprise. Disadvantages: banks may require lengthy formalities before approval of loan. Interest has to be paid, and there is a risk of losing personal belongings if the loan is not repaid on time. Here are some additional resources that you may use. Well, We have reached the end of today's lesson. Until the next, goodbye.